So, Ian, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode where we're kind of taking a look at the shifting consumer needs that we're seeing and kind of how banking customers obviously need to shift during this global pandemic that we're dealing with. So I first kind of want to get off the bat, if we could, like, what are some of those challenges that are being faced in the industry that financial institutions kind of have to deal with given this pandemic that is going on?
Thanks, Ryan. So if you think about it, we nobody had any time to prepare for this, right? It came so suddenly. I personally had to bring two young daughters in to start learning at home, so changing office layout. How do you engage the school? Banks had to do the same, right? They really had very little time to react, and so in a time where a lot of the branches, the physical locations that customers were engaging with them were either closing, being minimalized, or customers just didn't have the access that they traditionally have, and just having that impact of having to engage customers now digitally or through call centers was a big burden. And even from a consumer standpoint, not all customers are kind of digital savvy, so they all had to learn themselves on just how do you engage a bank. And you really saw it through some of the customers really doing a lot of call into the banks, and it really overwhelmed a lot of the banks call centers, just because if they couldn't access a physical branch and they weren't digital savvy, everyone's got a phone, so they're going to call in. So the reaction to that really triggered a lot of operational, but just how do you drive consumer behavior more digitally. And a lot of the banks had to lean into some of that experience that they've already been pushing their customers. But it was an abrupt change. Again, like I use the personal experiences, like, imagine trying to run a large financial institution and really changing a lot of the operational and consumer behaviors on a turn on a dime.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting. I mean, from a personal experience, my wife is a special needs teacher, right? And obviously, the education system is going through a major, just big change that's going
Right.
on right now. So I certainly am empathetic to, hey, we've got to stop, pause, and then completely change how it is that we're doing things. But one of the things that I found kind of interesting in that whole thing that kind of keeps coming up to my mind is just the education process, right? And I think that's one particular area where financial institutions can certainly separate themselves out in this marketplace. Is that, you brought up that, hey, the call centers were really kind of getting overwhelmed with some people that are like, hey, I've got to be, a digital first banking experience
Hmm.
because I can't go into these bank branches anymore. And kind of tying that all into just one of the things that I keep saying to my wife is, I'm like, hey, look, I think the district needs to really build up these digital assets to really educate people, not only just the students, but then also the parents that are involved in this process as well too, to be like, hey, okay, here's how these things work, here's how this works. And I think it can translate into financial institutions to saying like, hey, look, like, maybe let's get a lot of digital assets that go back to basics in terms of
Right.
101, because I think that we take for granted a lot of times that, like, hey, this should be just intuitive enough and 101 enough that anybody, as soon as you pick it up, should be able to get and understand and how to walk through this process. And that's really not the case. It's that I
Mhm.
think sometimes it comes a little bit from maybe possibly that you're so close to the project or so close to the app or the digital experience that you're just like, oh, well, it's so easy, you just do X,
Right.
Y, and Z things. But the fact of the matter is you hand that off to somebody else that has maybe never even seen it or doesn't interact with it often. They kind of go, I don't, what do you mean remote check
That's
deposit? What is that? How do I do that? So it's like, I think that financial institutions do really, like, they have that opportunity to really stand out by creating kind of that educational 101 model of like, here are things that you need to know now that we've kind of gotten into this new normal, so to speak, and what that looks like from a banking perspective. But I'm curious then to get from your standpoint. We talked about some banks closing, and then there's no longer that option to be able to visit the branch and talk 101 face to face with somebody there. So from your perspective, how are financial institutions continuing to ensure this positive consumer experience that they're hoping to deliver?
Yeah, I think so a lot of especially the larger financial institutions were building kind of their own capabilities for a long time already. You have examples even in the largest financial institutions where they had launched digital only banks and like capabilities to really address kind of the digital focused consumer. And so even though, so they were able, again, to use the term, to lean into that type of muscle memory that they had already been focused and investing in, was, probably put some of the banks in a pretty good position to have some learnings early on from that experience of again, building out that digital only process. But then you also have banks like USAA who only have one branch. They're fully digital. So you have just learnings in the marketplace where banks and credit unions are able to kind of leverage to really drive the non-digital users and how to educate them, as you said. But really, how do you push people into that? From a Zelle standpoint, we want people to use digital current, to move to digital payments more, and we actually saw an uptick, especially year over year. Year to date, we saw over $133 billion of Zelle transactions. That's over 500 million transactions itself. It's 60% increase from last year. So really just some strong first half of moving into kind of more digital. We also saw higher engagement. We saw a 43% increase in kind of engagement of 90-day users. So people are just using it more often. So not just once and done. It's they're engaging with their own network to send payments, but also just the digital account opening process. Again, banks, people didn't have access to the branches. So they had to learn how to use either an online experience or a digital mobile banking experience to actually open up banking accounts. And we definitely saw migration to those type of channels. I mean, even before COVID, I think it was like 55% of all new account openings were still happening in branches. So that when you remove the branches, now that volume has to go somewhere. So I'm sure it moved into more of a digital experience. And I'd say the last one was, and it was, we talk about digital payments, but just checks and how they were deposited into branches. You mentioned like remote deposit capture, using your phone to more or less deposit your check. Those, we saw a percentage up of about 23% of all checks being presented for deposit through RDC. And I mean, that's a significant amount of volume if you just think about digital presentment of checks. So those are some of the trends that we've seen. Again, but those will just continue as consumers and really the different demographics, right? The younger, more digitally savvy probably were already there, but as you migrate into different demographics, you're probably going to see those higher rates of adoption.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think from what we're kind of seeing here at Mercator Advisor Group, certainly there is just that large shift to digital payments itself and kind of just paper-based. And I mean that's true on consumer payments, and I think it's also very true on the business end of business payments as well too, where just there's not the physical people there to be able to say, okay, I can fill out this check, put it in an envelope, and it get to the location that it needs to get to. So there really has been kind of that quick, hey, we've got to shift to digital. We've got to move to digital. And I think there was a little bit of a panic at the beginning, but I think that's starting to kind of slow down just a little bit because more and more people have started to make those investments in the industry to say, okay, yes, we reckon, like, it was always one of those things in my mind that consumers and businesses were like, yep, digital is the way to go. And that's what we want. We see benefits to it, but it kind of took this pandemic to basically create that inertia, especially for businesses, to say, okay, we need to move away from checks and paper-based processes to more of an automated and digital system. But one of the things that I think I find particularly interesting about the payments industry as a whole is that I kind of look at it as a lot like jazz, in the sense that people kind of borrow a lot of things from each other to kind of make it a perfect fit, right, for them, to say, okay, this is my brand, but it's a little bit of over here, it's a little bit of over here, and it's a little bit of this with it. And so to kind of that perspective, I'd love to kind of get, what are you seeing in the marketplace that you think is really working well from kind of just that maybe particular some financial institutions are doing a particularly good at in terms of like navigating this new norm and kind of getting their customers up to speed,
Mhm.
so to speak. So what are some of the things that you're saying, hey, this is working really well, and those might be some things that certainly other organizations might want to take a look at and see, not necessarily how they can replicate it, but how they can kind of be like, I get the core and now let's change it a little bit to make it our own.
Yeah. What's interesting, so Early Warning, which is the company that owns Zelle, runs Zelle, we work heavily with very large financial institutions, but we have like over 2,600 clients, banks and credit unions. But I say all that because early on, immediately, it was about empathy and how do they actually support their consumers and their small business owners and their corporates. Like everyone's going through this unprecedented time. So where are they uniquely positioned to help, again, people get through this, either have access to money or access to new financial service type of like P2P, we were talking about Zelle earlier. But my point there is that there was this empathetic drive to really get banks to think differently than they have before. And so really from a I think about it in a couple of different ways. One, from a customer support standpoint. So what are the standard rules that they had in place that they could expand to help, again, consumers either migrate to safer digital payments or safer digital experiences? And you have a couple of examples, like US Bank came up with a way to engage their consumers through client support. So they're able to engage with them online, like we're doing right now over video, but also see what they see on their screen to help them through the process to get through the digital experience. And that's a pretty kind of like consumer facing impact, which is great. I know limits were another thing that some of the Zelle banks, like Bank of America, looked at small business limits through Zelle and increased those limits, I think, from 5 to 15,000 roughly. But just to make sure that their customers, small businesses, weren't hitting those issues that they were hitting pre-COVID. And then just general like waiving fees and kind of just making it, they don't want to add to the hardship of people who may be under financial distress, but waiving those fees. The other big bucket you mentioned was around like education. So Early Warning, again, runs Zelle, and so we had to focus on the bad guys, the bad actors in the network that are going after and trying to sell you a puppy and steal your money. So we did a lot of consumer education around that because, again, when these types of uncertainties happen, again, bad actors come out of the woodwork and they try to attack the vulnerable, unfortunately. But so we tried to create an education process where we were trying to inform people that there are these scams out there, that they should really be aware, make sure you're only sending money to friends and family, people that you know, rather than people that you don't know that you're buying potentially some goods from. Another one is we partnered with a nonprofit called Older Adults Technology Services, OATS for short, and it's really about helping the kind of an elderly population get an understanding of digital payments and digital banking experiences. And so really trying to help the education process, like you said, simplify it, get a demographic that you're traditionally not focused on, and helping them through kind of this process. And then the last one, I'd say just the general bucket would be around how do banks think about risk, and risk about how they engage customers. So I know some of the larger banks were definitely thinking about, hey, in a traditional underwriting model, and and this is supposed to be more digital, but if they're just thinking about new customers or helping customers get access to credit and the traditional ways aren't working in COVID, how do you underwrite a consumer based on their character rather than just they may be under a little bit of financial distress? So how do you build models or ways to look at the risk profile of customers that, again, think differently out of the box and more aligned with the times we're going through rather than a historical model? So that really lends to like consumer health, consumer financial health, we'll say, and being able to, again, not look at kind of the trade lines of a specific credit portfolio, but like what was their deposit activity? How long have they been customers? Like those are the types of things that help banks think differently and change kind of their risk profile, and again, to help customers get access to those services rather than shutting them down. And then, the social responsibility that banks really underline all of these um, scenarios I was just mentioning. It's just really around, they're just trying to do what's right for consumers in a really unprecedented time. And you just see that across all of them. How do you think differently? How do you help people who who are hesitant to engage in certain digital ways? How do you educate them, and how do you get them access to the kind of the money and the credit that they need to get through these difficult times? So those are a lot of the trends.
Well, Ian, thank you so much for taking the time today for speaking to me about how financial institutions need to shift to meet their banking consumer needs.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me.